there was obviously a lot of debate within Kentucky about what this state would do. And in fact, Governor McGoffin, who I'll talk about in a minute, actually called a special session of the legislature in January 1861, as he put it, to discuss Kentucky's relationship to this national situation. Well, most of the states that seceded from the Union actually either took a vote within their state legislature, or they actually called special conventions to determine their stand on the question. And invariably, most of those that did secede did it in that sort of a setting. Such an event was never held in Kentucky, and there's no official record of any kind of an official discussion of secession. So we find Kentucky going into the early part of 1861 as the sides are beginning to form, and they have not officially encouraged the federal government to think that they will participate on that side, and they have not seceded in order to become a part of the Confederate States of America. Well, so what eventually happened was that on May of 1861, both houses of the state legislature passed resolutions saying that Kentucky would be neutral throughout the Civil War. And as you notice there, it meant that the state of Kentucky would provide neither men nor money to either side, and also they basically served notice to both sides that they would not tread on the soil of Kentucky. Now, the whole concept of neutrality is very interesting, and certainly the notice to both sides that they would not be allowed to come across our state is one, you can say it, but enforcing that, of course, is something different. And it is known that the Kentucky State Guard had an outstanding organization and was very well equipped, but I don't think it was going to be possible for them to stop either the Union Army or the Confederate Army from coming across. And this actually ended in September, early September of 1861, when the Confederate Army crossed the Mississippi River and entered Columbus, Kentucky, which sits right there on the Mississippi River shoreline. And the legislature, first of all, demanded that that Confederate Army leave the state, which it did not, and then it proceeded to pass legislation indicating to the federal government that Kentucky would, in fact, provide men and money to the U.S. government during the ensuing national crisis. Now, there were a lot of Kentuckians who were not happy about that, those who had actually desired for Kentucky to secede from the Union. And so what they did was they went down to Russellville, Kentucky, in Logan County, and there they actually came together. They hadn't been elected or sent there by anyone. There was just a notice put out saying, everyone that wants to discuss, Kentucky's status in the Civil War, meet at Russellville. And what they did there was create what's called the Provisional Government of Kentucky. It was formed on 16 November 1861. They proceeded to elect a provisional governor and a sort of a mini legislature, if you will, of about 10 people and a public printer. I think, it's pretty obvious all governments have to have somebody to do their printing, so that was one of the positions that they did elect, was someone to publish the things that they printed. The governor then, as I'll talk about in a minute, sent a request to the Confederate States of America, and in fact, Kentucky's representation by that provisional government was accepted into the Confederate States of America, and a star was placed on the Confederate flag that represented Kentucky, even though Kentucky had never officially seceded from the Union. So we were one of the few states that actually had a star in both the flag of the United States and the flag of the Confederate States of America from December on through the end of the Civil War. Now, another thing that gave strong indication of Kentucky's overall view was in June of 1861, President Lincoln had called for a special session of Congress. And that when that special session was held to elect those that would go to Congress, the resulting vote was overwhelmingly pro-Union. So that gave a very interesting indication of a large part of the population of Kentucky at that time. And then in August, they held the regular state elections for legislature. And again, the pro-Union majority was quite a bit more than that would be called pro-states' rights or pro-Confederate. So those are two things that are some indication of what the viewpoints of the majority of Kentuckians were as we went through 1861. In the handout I gave you all, in addition to my PowerPoint, I gave you a copy of this map and of the next one, and also a bibliography of some of what I consider to be the better books about the Kentucky Civil War experience. And I wanted to show you this tonight because one of the things that was definitely true was that both the North and the South were very desirous of Kentucky becoming a part of their side. The Confederacy definitely wanted Kentucky. they actually couldn't understand why Kentucky had not seceded since it was a slaveholding state. And again, there's that generalization of, well, if you're a slaveholding state, then you obviously want to join us. And that was a fallacy, as it turned out. Another thing that's very true, and being a native Kentuckian myself and having served in the Air Force, Kentucky has a rich military heritage. The men and women in subsequent years of Kentucky have served from the very earliest days of the settlement of Kentucky in military roles up through present day. Today we even have fellow Kentuckians who are deployed over in the Middle East. So the men of Kentucky was something that both sides were very eager to get. This won't surprise you that the horse flesh of Kentucky was something that both sides wanted. Mules and horses were greatly sought after, and both the Union and the Confederacy wanted those. We're obviously an outstanding agricultural state, and they wanted our foodstuffs. And, as you all know, the very northern border of Kentucky is completely described by the Ohio River. You may not know that at that time in the Civil War, there were no bridges that crossed the Ohio River from Kentucky to Ohio or Indiana. There were none. So you have a very nice natural boundary there that the Confederacy certainly wanted that would prevent the Union Army from being readily able to cross over into Kentucky and further into the South. And then, of course, the westernmost border is the Mississippi River. And then the easternmost border is, of course, the Appalachian Mountains. And the only way, really, that you could get into the state with any ready access at that time was through Cumberland Gap and then some of the other gaps that were also you were able to go through. But so Kentucky has some very nice natural boundaries and barriers against the movement of armies, and that's a lot of the reasons why both sides really hoped that Kentucky would join them. Now, as I mentioned, President Lincoln, of course, as we all know, had moved from Kentucky to Indiana as a young man and then on to Illinois. And he, being a native Kentuckian, he also was very apparently aware of Kentucky's status and the fact that there was perhaps a potential there that it would go into the Confederacy. So he did sort of treat Kentucky with kid gloves during the early years. And then later on, when it became confirmed that Kentucky was not going to join the Confederacy, the federal government took some more strict and more strong-handed actions in the state, as I'll talk about in a minute, which had some long-term effects in the post-Civil War years. So you have a copy of that map, because I know in your handout, that map is almost unreadable, it's so small, but you do have a one-page copy of that at the end of the PowerPoint slide. This is basically what Kentucky looked like after the Confederacy had first moved into it in Columbus, and then subsequently, after the provisional government was created, they had decided that Bowling Green would be the capital of that provisional government, and it remained there until January of 1862. So with the beginning of the presence of Confederate forces in Kentucky, as you see that dashed line, basically below that line would be in control of Confederate forces, and everything above that line was pretty much in the control of the Union forces at that time. Now, because Kentucky was neutral from May through September of 1861, there were large numbers of men and supplies being organized in the East, in what we call the Eastern Theater of the Civil War, Virginia and Maryland, that area, and also in the West, which would be just across the Mississippi and Missouri in that area. And as a result, there was very little military preparation going on here in Kentucky. And in fact, the gentleman I mentioned to you a minute ago, Major Robert Anderson, after the Fort Sumter crisis, he eventually surrendered the fort, and President Lincoln knew or felt that the people of Kentucky would best respond to military influence and leadership of a Kentuckian. So Anderson was promoted from a major to a brigadier general and placed in charge of military preparations in Kentucky. Now, because Kentucky was neutral, his initial headquarters was located in Cincinnati, which you guys are well familiar with where that's at. And then when neutrality ended in September, he actually moved his Army headquarters to the city of Louisville, because by that point then, Kentucky had confirmed that it would be an active part and support the Union effort. Very early after the neutrality had ended and Anderson had become the military commander over the activities here, something began, and that was the imprisonment of civilians. And even early on, he was only actually responsible for Kentucky for a few months before I think his health caught up with him and he asked to be relieved of duty. He had sent a notice out notifying people that this indiscriminate arrest and imprisonment of civilians was to stop. These people were being arrested on charges of disloyalty to the United States. They were being put in jails. Some of them were actually shipped off across the Ohio River into Ohio and Illinois, Maryland. Eventually, they actually even arrested some women and put them in a prison and made them sew uniforms for the Union Army. This went on certainly throughout most of the Civil War, but this was something that definitely happened here in Kentucky. And as I note there were noted politicians that were arrested. One of the governors of Kentucky, just prior to the one who was governor when the Civil War began, Governor Moorhead, was arrested and imprisoned for about 4 months. And once he was released, he decided to head to Canada and ended up, after the Civil War, I think, residing in the state of Mississippi. For some reason, he never came back to Kentucky for any long-term time. And another gentleman by the name of Reuben Durrett, who was a very important part of the early days of the Filson Club, which is now known as the Filson Historical Society in Louisville, he was also arrested. So there were a lot of well-known people that were scarfed up in these arrests that were being carried out, and also a lot of less well-known citizens. And to be very honest, if you look at the facts, you can see that because of the nature of the Civil War, this arrest of people on claims of their disloyalty was often the way some people used just to get back at somebody they didn't like. And they would go down and say, well, you know, Joe, my neighbor down here, has been threatening to do this and that, or burn the bridge because he doesn't want the Union Army to use it. And they would arrest him and imprison him. A lot of them were only kept for a while, and then they let him go, and some were actually in prison and kept for quite some time. But one of the very unpleasant parts of the experience, not only of Kentucky, but certainly of other states, but certainly something that went on here. Let me just go over very briefly with you the major battles of the Civil War that were fought here in Kentucky. Now, there are actually 326 battles, skirmishes, and military actions that were fought. The battles are obvious. I'm going to talk about just a few of those. Those would be when significant numbers of men would come together and have a battle of some duration. The actions would be some less scope as far as the number of men. Skirmishes. And the actions would be maybe 3 or 4 cavalrymen on one side and 2 or 3 of another. Just something that was actually documented as having happened. But there are actually 326 of these different kinds of military actions that occurred in Kentucky during the Civil War. Unfortunately, many of them you can find referred to in the official records of the Civil War, but without going to the specific county or into the court records that deal with some of them, a lot of it's not been documented, and it's something that really would be of interest if people in the different counties and areas could find out more about that. But one of the early significant battles in Kentucky was the Battle of Mill Springs. It occurred west of Somerset, Pulaski County, occurred on the morning of January 19, 1862. And as you'll note there, it was one of the first significant Union victories of the Civil War. At that point, there had been several rather noteworthy Union defeats, so they were very eager to have a Union victory. The commander, the Union commander, was General George H. Thomas. He was a native Virginian. People that were in his family expected him to join the Confederate Army when the Civil War began. He was a West Pointer, and he felt that his loyalty was to the federal government. And so he actually had become the second commander at Camp Dick Robinson, very close to where I live there in Danville. And he was the Union commander. The Confederate commander was General Felix Zollicoffer. He actually sounds like he came from overseas, but it's only his name that came from overseas. He was actually a Tennessean, had been a state politician and a newspaper editor. And in the battle that took place on a very cold, wintry Sunday morning, he was actually killed. And when the Confederate Army forces saw that their general had been killed, they quickly left the battlefield. And eventually the Union had control of the field. They picked up their own dead and wounded, and also those of the Confederates, and buried them in a mass grave there, which remains there today. One of the other significant battles was the Battle of Richmond, which has only just recently been commemorated for its 150th anniversary. It occurred in 1862. It was part of